Leaders from all the branches of the military are talking about new ways to assess readiness. The missing link for the Defense Department might be adaptability. Lieutenant General David Barno, U.S. Army retired, and Dr. Nora Bensahel are visiting professors of strategic studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and contributing editors at War on the Rocks. They're co-authors of the new book, Adaptation Under Fire: How Militaries Change in Wartime. Friends, welcome. Thanks for coming back on the program. Congratulations on the book. Nora, you and Dave write in this piece on War on the Rocks, is U.S. military adaptable enough to prevail in the wars of the 21st century? Is that a rhetorical question, or are you seeking an answer there, Nora?
No, that's the question that motivated us to write the book in the first place, and we concluded that the answer might unfortunately be no. We talked about a lot about what we mean by adaptation. We note a lot of the challenges that the U.S. military in particular faces with adaptation, looking at some historical cases, but also the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and offering some very specific recommendations in the conclusion for how to improve this absolutely essential attribute of all militaries, but particularly the U.S. military.
Nora, adaptability seems to me to be especially important in light of the citation that you and Dave make. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates once noted that since Vietnam, the United States has a perfect record of predicting the next war. Secretary Gates said, "We've never once gotten it right." Why does that accelerate the need to be adaptable?
Well, it's impossible to correctly predict the next war, and it always has been. And so there's always some amount of adaptation that's needed when a war actually occurs. But for a variety of reasons, we think that gap, we call it the adaptability gap between the expected war and what might actually happen, is growing because we live in a very uncertain strategic environment, because the U.S. is a global power and doesn't know exactly when or where it's going to fight next, and because our adversaries are likely to surprise us with how they fight, where they fight, and some of the technologies that they fight with. So for all of those reasons, the challenge for the U.S. military in being able to adapt quickly enough to adjust to whatever the next war is, we think is growing and needs to be addressed.
Dave, welcome, and congratulations to you as well. Two observations that you and Nora make in this piece. Future wars will involve two entirely new domains of warfare, and we're living in a time of exponential change. Those two domains, space and cyber, are potentially the greatest theaters of that exponential change, aren't they?
I think that's right. And we're going to be in an environment where we've never fought wars in those domains before. There's no history or lessons learned to draw on. It's in some ways like the advent of air power in the early 20th century before World War I. No one knew how that was going to unfold. And when the war broke out, planes went from having a minor role, taking pictures, observing, to, by the end of the war, bombers, strafing ground troops, and arguably becoming the most important domain in years to come. So I think we're going to see the same thing with space and cyber. We don't really understand how dramatic that could possibly be in the next conflict.
So the wrinkle that Nora introduced a moment ago, Dave, that idea that we don't know where or when an enemy might strike, in those two domains where there's not really established lessons learned type doctrine. We have doctrine now from Space Force, and we have some cyber doctrine too, but we don't know that that's necessarily based on something that's actually happened to us before. What's the context then of adaptability in trying to respond or maybe even take action in those domains?
Well, I think essentially we're going to have to see what happens. We have both offensive and defensive capabilities in cyber and space. Those have not been exercised in a major conflict before. We can expect that our adversaries will have the same. And so whatever doctrine we might have and whatever thinking we have established on how this could unfold now, in all likelihood, it's going to explode on the first day of the next war. And we're going to have to be able to see what happens, make rapid decisions to change what we're doing, to respond to what the adversary is doing, and then to outmaneuver him in those two domains where there's no tradition of how you actually attain success and achieve victory. So this is going to be incredibly difficult. And it's also going to impact the other domains of air, land, and sea as well. Every one of those depends upon space capabilities. Every one of those depends deeply now on cyber capabilities. And so in some ways, our conventional military, which has been vested in those domains, may be outmaneuvered from day one by these two new domains that are going to be so dominant.
Nora, you make a number of recommendations in this book and in this piece. What's the biggest gap? You're writing about an adaptability gap. What's the biggest gap between what the department and the military is not doing now and that it should be doing to reach this vision that you and Dave have?
Well, we offer about 20 specific recommendations, but we think one of the most important ones is to strengthen professional military education for U.S. military officers. The kind of environment that we're going to be in the future, where decisions are being made literally at the speed of light in cyberspace, is going to require very creative thinkers, people who can think outside the box, who can react remarkably quickly. And we're concerned that professional military education currently doesn't do quite enough of that. We think that advanced civilian schooling, graduate degrees for military officers is important as a complement also to what they get in professional military education, because that challenges them to think differently, to have different people inside a classroom with them, and to really have a very, very different experience that they can draw on and that will help later in their careers. But that's only one of a number of recommendations.
Dave, we have about 15 seconds left. When you were in Afghanistan, what was the skills gap, the knowledge gap that you needed there that you think that better professional education would fill?
Well, clearly to understand the enemy that wasn't like what we were expecting and that we hadn't prepared for and that I hadn't trained for in my career up until that point in time. So being able to see what I was dealing with on the battlefield, adjust to that, and make new plans based on that was an incredibly important skill.
Dave Barno, Nora Bensahel, congratulations on your book. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.